Welcome to Innovation Inside the Box. Drew Boyd teaches teams, businesses, and governments how to solve tough problems to create a culture of innovation and a flowing pipeline. Innovation Inside the Box features structured creativity and innovation strategies for leaders who want to think differently, be more innovative, implement change, and grow. The conversations you'll hear will help you apply innovation methods to services and processes, overcome resistance to ideas, and create a culture of innovation. Here's your host, Drew Boyd.
As one thing changes, another thing changes. Let me say it again. As one thing changes, another thing changes. Well, I'll tell you what, if you can just remember that phrase, you have added to your creativity arsenal a very powerful tool. That is the operative phrase of the fifth of 5 techniques in the SIT method called Attribute Dependency. And I want to spend some time in this episode exploring this tool in more detail. Now, a few episodes ago, I think last year actually, I did an entire episode about it. You can go back and listen to it. But in this episode, I want to talk about some of the things I observe when my students learn this technique and give you some ideas about how to bring this very powerful technique up and ready to use. Now, to be honest with you, attribute dependency, out of the 5 techniques, I have to be honest and say what I say to my students, that it's the badass creativity technique for sure. It's the hardest to learn. It is, I think, the hardest to teach. And it's hard because it's somewhat abstract, and it has a lot of subtleties and nuances that just make it a little bit more complex than the others. So let me go through with you and remind you what attribute dependency is. This is the technique where something is going to change in response to something else. Thus the phrase, as one thing changes, another thing changes. Attribute dependency is when you create a correlation or a dependency, or you break a correlation or dependency between 2 attributes in the system. Typically what that means is you're taking an attribute of the product or the service that you're wanting to innovate. An attribute it's a very important thing to know what that means. An attribute is like a characteristic or something that can vary. The color, the material, the weight, the location, the function. Anything that can change about a product or a situation is a candidate for attribute dependency. And then you make it correlate or tie to or change in response to some other attribute, either of the product or if it's immediate environment. Meaning the product all of a sudden becomes adaptable. It becomes smart. And that is the real beauty of this, this really powerful technique. But as I said before, this is the one that gives students the most trouble on their final exam and my clients the most trouble. Here's why they struggle with it. First of all, you're not dealing with components. You have to think more abstractly about the characteristics. You have to look at, say, this coffee cup that's right beside me here. And your mind has to be flexible enough to say, what is it? What are the variables? What are the aspects or characteristics or things that could change about this coffee cup? Certainly its size, its material, where the handle is located, the fluid that's inside of it. And so you start to think about those types of variables. And then you think about things that are external to this coffee cup. It's still very prevalent, like time of day or the user, the person who's going to use the coffee cup, or the where in the room it's being used. And so you imagine these correlations. Something about the cup is going to change in response to that. So imagine the cup handle. Here's a simple one. The cup handle changes depending on who's picking it up. And so if my wife, who has smaller hands than I do, picks this up, this thing could be squeezed down to be more adaptable to her hand size. That's a simple attribute dependency. And then, of course, when I pick it up, I can expand it out to the size that I like that fits my hand better. So when you start to learn this technique, you begin to realize this technique is all around you. I mean, it's really everywhere. Anything that's changing in your life, anything that's responding to one thing. Here are some examples. For example, your windshield wipers of your car that speed up or slow down depending on the amount of rain that's falling. Classic attribute dependency. Cars have lots of attribute dependency in them. You look around to your home, and if you have any rooms in your house where the light switch comes on automatically depending on whether somebody walks in, that is an attribute dependency. So anything that has variability to it. Now the question is, great, but how do I use it? Well, there are two ways. One is very technical and rather challenging, and then one way is rather easy and sort of, I'll call it the quick and dirty method. So let me briefly, I'll tell you what the harder method is. I'm not going to go into great detail about it, but it's the method where you create a two-dimensional matrix, like a spreadsheet. Think about a spreadsheet, and here in the spreadsheet you put all the different variables of the coffee cup and its environment, for example, if that's what you're innovating, and then the cells of the spreadsheet, the matrix, essentially help you create those combinations of dependencies. But you know what? I have found over the years that I can get people using this technique. I mean, like fourth graders or CEOs, engineers, anybody, I can get them using the technique in a much faster way, but maybe not as complete, but at least good enough. So here's what you do. Get out a piece of paper, and I want you to pick something around you right now that you could experiment with and innovate. It can be anything. A picture hanging on your wall, a light hanging down from your ceiling, the table you're sitting at, the car seat that you're in right now, whatever. You shouldn't be writing things down in your car, but let's just say take out a piece of paper, and you're going to make two lists. On the left side of the list, you're going to put things in a numbered list, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. And you're going to put the things that are external to the product, but immediately around you. And meaning those are the things that you don't really control, but that still happen and vary around you. Let's go back to the coffee cup. That's the easiest example for me right now. So imagine the coffee cup, the things around it that change are the user who uses the cup, the amount of fluid that's put into it, the time of day, the temperature of the fluid that's put inside of it, the other added elements to it, cream and sugar, for example, and where it's being used and what room it's being used. So those are we'll call those the variables right around the product or service. Then to the right of that, make a second list, but in this case, don't number them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Instead, letter them A, B, C, D, E, and so on. And those are going to be the variables of the coffee cup itself, the things that could change, like the shape, the material, the height, the width, the volume, the color, the printing on the outside, the location of the handle. Those are the things that, as a manufacturer, so to speak, I would have control of. If I wanted to make changes to the thing, I can do that as the owner of this coffee cup. So, all right, so now you have two lists. You've got the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 list on the left-hand side. Then you have the A, B, C, D, E list on the right-hand side. All you do is this. You randomly pick a number from the left side. Then you randomly pick a letter from the right side. And you smash them together, which is the ultimate creativity act, right? Bringing two unrelated things together. And you make a dependency out of it. And here's what I like to use. Let's go back to that very first phrase. As one thing changes, another thing changes. If you keep that in mind, you're going to do this exercise correctly. So it would sound like this. As number 5 on the list changes, letter D changes. The item associated with letter D changes. And then I look at what I have, and let's say it's something like, as the temperature of the fluid changes, the color of the coffee cup changes. Okay, that actually exists. That's a coffee cup that as you put hot liquid into it, it changes the color on the outside, or something shows up on the outside. So that was kind of a ringer. I knew that product existed out there. But then you might find things that are really out there. Let me go ahead and try it right now. I didn't prepare this ahead of time. Let's say as time of day changes, the shape changes. Okay, that's weird. And so what I would try to imagine is, why would this coffee cup change shape depending on the time of day? Well, for example, what if it's a coffee cup that can change shape to make it easier to store or easier to clean? or easier to use. In other words, I start to think about a shape-shifting, try to say that 6 times, a shape-shifting coffee cup that now adapts to me as the user in situations where it's important for it to change. That's how this technique works, and it is powerful and it is abstract. But this is the best way for you to practice it, is with these 2 lists, and give yourself the chance to create some correlations, what we call clever correlations in our book, about things that would never have been there before. It's a great technique to break another type of fixedness called relational fixedness. That's the fixedness that makes it very hard for us to imagine 2 variables, 2 attributes of the environment, all of a sudden having a correlation that wasn't there before. Now, when I teach this to my students, I had one student that described it well. She says, this makes things adaptable, makes them smart. And she was absolutely right. This is how companies take any product and imagine it changing in response to something the owner wants, so that it is now a smart product. It's adaptable. It does cool things to make it infinitely more valuable to the customer than if it were just a sort of a sitting static piece of product. Anyway, that's the attribute dependency technique. It's the idea that as one thing changes, another thing changes. Take a try at this. Try to add this to your arsenal. Start slowly and just think about anything. Look at anything around you and imagine it morphing and changing in response to something you want. You're on your way to using this, the most powerful of the SIT tools. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you like what you're hearing here, go ahead and be sure to subscribe, or send this episode along to somebody else that's maybe thinking about how to be more creative. There's some good tips in these every week, and I look forward to having you with us next week.